Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St.Gallen podcast by Julian Kölbel. Harald Walkate here on the podcast. Harald, it's great to have you.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's wonderful to see you and hear you again.
Yeah. So, Harald, we'll talk about this theme you brought up in articles recently, which is blended finance is like music. I can't wait to get into it. Before we do, though, just let's talk a little bit about you. You did an MBA at Chicago Booth, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So that is the school that's famous for many things, of course, but it's also famous for Milton Friedman and his statement, well, the responsibility of business is to increase its profit.
Yeah.
So pretty unapologetic on that front. Now, you are, I think it's fair to describe you as an expert in sustainable finance. How did that happen?
No, it's a really good question because when I first started getting into ESG or sustainable finance, it was about 2009 when I was working at Aegon Asset Management. And I had an interest in sustainability and all those things. And so I thought that was an interesting development that people started talking about responsible investment in ESG and so forth. But in part, this was because I thought, hey, that's a way to use money, finance to solve problems. But in part, it was also because I thought this was a little bit of a riddle because ESG people, responsible investment people, were saying a lot of things that kind of challenged the things that I learned in business school. And not only from reading Milton Friedman, but from reading many other, well-known finance academics, Nobel Prize winning academics and so forth. And I think actually that has really helped me, this maybe somewhat skeptical attitude, and to this something I also learned at Chicago Booth is sort of this discipline of rigorously thinking about everything, never just accepting any assumption, challenge everything, that sort of approach. And that, I think, in combination with this desire to make a contribution, have impact, I think has helped get me to where I am today with, I would say, pretty significant expertise on a lot of these different aspects of ESG and sustainable finance. So while I don't agree with everything that Milton Friedman said, I agree with a lot. And I think Friedman also really helped me get to where I am today.
Right. So it seems you're in the business then of challenging the assumptions in ESG and sustainable finance. That is definitely a theme I can take away.
Yes.
Now, in addition to that, so in saying blended finance is like music, we'll get to the blended finance part, but I hear you are also actually a musician, so you wouldn't make this analogy lightly, I should say. What do you play?
Yeah. Yes, I am a musician. I play the piano, mostly jazz piano, which is, so I play in different size groups. And so jazz, as you may know, involves a lot of improvisation. And we shouldn't sort of overemphasize the analogy between music and the sustainable finance, but one thing that has also helped me in my career is the ability to improvise, and that's also sometimes been very central to my work.
No, I think we will stretch the analogy to as far as we can go. I think that's going to be fun. So again, thank you, Harald. It's really great to have you. Now, blended finance. This is one of the frontiers in sustainable finance, clearly. Perhaps for starters, you could give us a bit of an intro. What is blended finance?
Before I do that, maybe just you say something very interesting. It's sort of like it's the next frontier or the news thing or cutting edge in sustainable finance. I think it's almost like the reverse. It's okay. To explain this, I've hit upon a concept that I didn't come up with myself, but I read about recently, and I should look up who said it so I can sort of give credit where credit's due. But basically, the concept is comparing sustainable finance with financing sustainability. This is, it may sound like it's not very important, but I think it's very important because sustainable finance is sort of what you and I are really interested in, is like this whole set of tools that you can use, to take ESG considerations into account, to do impact investing, what have you. And the whole idea is that it's a new set of tools that you can help to solve societal problems. And, also going back to what you said earlier, I like to challenge assumptions. I think if you challenge a lot of the assumptions underlying sustainable finance, you realize that actually many of these tools don't really work, or don't really work very well. And if the goal is to finance sustainability, to find projects or solutions to societal challenges and to find the money to actually make these programs or projects happen, I think we're now realizing that often we just kind of need to go back to the stuff that we knew all along, the stuff that we learned in business school from Milton Friedman, and use the finance tools that we have used for decades, if not centuries, to actually fund these problems. And so that's why I like to talk about this concept from, going from sustainable finance to financing sustainability. And therefore, just to, answer your question in a very roundabout way, I don't really think blended finance is sort of the new frontier. It's one of the examples of kind of going back to stuff we already knew. And so now to answer your question, what is blended finance? I mean, just in a very simplistic way, it is the blending, literally, the bringing together of different sources of capital, where one source of capital typically comes from governments or philanthropy, and is concessional, is willing to accept a higher risk or a lower return than other investors. And in doing so, basically, you're attracting private sector investors. You're making projects that would normally be considered uninvestable, investable. And so why is this important? Well, because the deep pockets in the world of finance are typically with the pension funds, the insurance companies, the sovereign wealth funds. Those are all organizations who have very strict investment criteria because they need to invest to pay out pensions, to pay out clients, and so forth. And if we want to use their deep pockets of capital to fund solutions to societal problems, we basically need to structure the investments in such a way that they say, hey, this is a good investment. We can make this investment, and then we can scale up everything that needs to be done.
These pension funds, sovereign wealth funds you mentioned, they have a mandate, they have a fiduciary duty to fulfill. And that is your point, that they will naturally not invest in projects that, as you said, are uninvestable, because right from the start, you might accept a lower return than you might otherwise get. And these institutions typically just cannot, simply for legal reasons, ever entertain any such idea. So blended finance is the idea of mixing their money in a capital structure with funds from other institutions who could do that, and basically out of that create something that drives change.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So you said one thing in your introduction, and you phrased it as sort of, the tools in sustainable finance do not really work. So when you say really work, what do you mean by that?
Well, so that's a very good question. And so to answer that question, we have to be very clear also about what we are actually trying to achieve. And there's some very smart academics who did a lot of thinking about this, mostly academics associated with the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth. You may know some of them, Julian, who started writing about this about the same time that I started thinking about this. And so you have to distinguish basically, again, somewhat simplistically, between three different objectives that investors have in using ESG tools or sustainable finance tools. Basically, it's values alignment, it's financial, so that means a higher return or lower risk, or it's impact, saving the world or contributing to a better world or solving problems. So again, one is values alignment, two is financial, three is impact. And so to answer the question, do ESG tools work? You first have to be clear on what you actually were using it for. And so, I have a slide that goes into a lot of detail where I look at all the different ESG tools and I compare them to all of the three objectives. And basically, what you conclude from that slide is almost everything that you can do with sustainable finance works if the point is values alignment. You have certain values and you're doing ESG stuff and kind of makes you feel good. And so in that sense, that's all great. Everything is working.
So that would be, just to make an example, if I don't like a certain industry, whatever it may be, tobacco, and then I just do not invest, I exclude it. That would be values alignment.
Exactly. So that, often people use divestment or exclusions as a way to kind of give expression to their desire to align values with investments. But so it could also be ESG integration, could also be for values alignment. You take into account environmental and social factors when you make investment decisions. That's also, if that's in line with your values, to pay attention to these factors, that's great. Engagement on ESG issues can also work for values alignment. You're talking to company management about, how they deal with their employees or about environmental issues. All great for values alignment. So, but the more important questions, I think, for you and me is, and for practitioners out there, is the question: does it in fact also help with financial objectives? Does it generate higher returns, or does it help manage risks? Or, and that's, I think, the most important question of all, does it also have impact? And does it in fact result in sort of real world outcomes? Are we allowing things to happen that otherwise wouldn't happen? And so on those two counts, unfortunately, for many of the sustainable finance tools, we know now, based on the academic research, much of which you've also contributed to, that unfortunately many of the tools do not generate higher returns, and many of the tools do not lead to real world outcomes. And so that means that we have to be very careful if we have this objective to have impact, to reallocate money so that it contributes to the sustainable development goals, for example. We have to make sure that we pick the tools that will actually help us do that.
I mean, I agree with that, of course, that there are these three objectives, and it's kind of a trick question, right? Does it work? And you answered very well. It depends on what you want to use it for, and of course, this is a huge question. This question around impact. After all, why is it called sustainable finance? I mean, one reasonable assumption would be, well, because it somehow helps us to achieve more sustainability. So it is front and center, I believe. Yeah, I'm curious. So you seem to have concluded that blended finance is, has good potential to work in that sense, as it were. You've already indicated a little bit what it's about. It's about mixing funds from different actors. And I mean, let's introduce your theme of blended finance is like music. Who are the players that you see playing in this? I don't know if you have more a symphony or a jazz band in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it can work for any kind of music ensemble as long as it's more than one person playing. That's kind of key. Yeah, so I'll tell you where this came from, because I've been thinking and talking about impact investment and blended finance with two other guys, Robert van Zwieten and Simon Gupta. And we shared sort of the same, sort of analysis of the problem, but also ideas about how we can solve the problem, mainly through blended finance. And we started talking about this and also kind of the different actors. So, governments, asset owners like pension funds or insurance companies, asset managers, investment banks, development banks, foundations, entrepreneurs. I mean, there's this whole ecosystem really that needs to be involved. And in our conversations at some point, I guess it was probably me who started saying, it's kind of like a symphony orchestra. You need all these different people with a different skill sets. I mean, playing the violin and playing percussion or playing the trumpets, these are really different things. You need different people. You need someone who plays the trumpet really well, and you need someone who plays the violin really well. So that was kind of the starting point. And then we said, hey, we could write some articles about this, because also all these different actors kind of have different roles or different things they should be doing or not doing in order for us to generate more blended finance. So that's where the idea came from. And then in each of these 6 articles that we ended up writing, we zoom in on one of the actors. So, we have an article about the role of governments. We have an article about the role of asset owners, and an article about the role of ESG professionals. But each article is based on this idea is like, okay, you're trying to put together a symphony, you're putting on a concert. What do you need to think about to bring all of these people together? And maybe just to add an additional thought, because the analogy works in the sense that, it's about making music, and each has like their own specific contribution that only they can make. But the organizational aspect is also really important, because what we also emphasize in the articles is that if you want to put on a concert, the musicians aren't just going to magically show up,
Right.
on the same day, at the same time, the same place. No, you have to have someone who says, hey, we're going to organize a concert, and they need to pick the venue, and they need to pick a date, and they need to actually inform people so that people buy a ticket and that you can actually fund the whole arrangement. And then you need to make sure that, there's a conductor. You need to make sure that someone actually decides what you're going to play, that everyone has the same sheet music in front of them, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more than about just, playing the music. And this is also a very good analogy with what needs to happen in blended finance, because that's also one of the main things that is holding us up, is there isn't really one single party that is doing the convening, that is doing like the producer of the blended finance symphony orchestra. And that's what we also need.
I find that a very interesting point, because as I hear you speak, the situation that different stakeholders come together to create something is very common, actually, right? There are tons of organizations, companies that do exactly that. Of course, there are orchestras and bands who meet every Wednesday to practice. So that in itself is very common. But what you said last, that there needs to be someone who takes the initiative to start the whole thing, right? In classic corporate governance, that would be usually, that role is attributed to the shareholders. They're the ones, the residual claimant. They put their capital at risk, and they sort of contract with everybody else to get the whole thing rolling. They install a manager, pay them as well. So that function, of course, is somehow not there in this blended finance situation, because the person who organizes everything is not at the end, or somehow cannot be the one who takes away most of the profit if things goes well. Anyways, maybe that could be the case, but it doesn't seem to happen at the moment.
Yeah.
Another, maybe you have thoughts on that, but another thing is, of course, somehow the secret sauce to this musical dish is the parties that say, well, we want to invest in order to have impact, right? So maybe you can lose a word or two about those. It seems that who are these, and and why does it make sense for them to go into blended finance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we should also, you made another very important point earlier about sort of the shareholders and taking the initiative and so forth. I think that points to a very important problem that we have in blended finance. But maybe first to answer this question. Yeah, so typically these organizations who are trying to have impact are development banks, could be sort of entrepreneurs or kind of initiators. Entrepreneurs already sounds like, you're starting a business and you're looking for venture capital funding and so forth. Often these kinds of projects aren't really designed with a view to, attracting capital in the first instance, at least. It's not the most important priority. Anyway, but so you can call them entrepreneurs, people who say, hey, I see an issue here. I see there's a lack of education in this country, or we need to address, maternal health or poverty or climate change, what have you. And I'm going to start a project. But it could also be, sort of nonprofits, NGOs, governments. It's a broad range of actors. And so the reason that it's that they should think about blended finance as a tool that could help them is that it's often very difficult first to get funding for these projects. But even if they do, it's very difficult to get the funding that allows them to really scale this up. And that's where blended finance can come in handy because, again, it gives you a tool to get access to the deep pockets in finance. But that again, then comes with this whole range of barriers and problems that you need to overcome to actually get there.
So I think it's maybe a good time for an example to make the whole thing a bit more practical.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of a blended finance deal that illustrates some of what we've been saying?
Sure. And I thought about this a little bit. I'm working on a couple of projects now, but that's all kind of happening as we speak.
Okay.
But one project I can probably talk about quite safely because it's a little bit sort of in the past and it's all in the public domain. When I worked at Aegon, I was involved in setting up of a fund that's called Climate Investor One, and I certainly don't want to sort of overclaim my contribution, but one of the things that I did, I think, to help was to introduce the people who were setting this up to my colleagues at Aegon, the people, or Aegon Asset Management, the people who are really responsible for allocation of capital. Anyway, so that gave me an opportunity to, at the early stage of this process, to kind of see what they were up to and how they were going about it. And I've remained in touch with people who did this. And so the company who set up this fund is called Climate Fund Managers, and it's a joint venture of FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, and a South African infrastructure investment company. Anyway, so that's all not so important, but if you want to look it up, you can find this all online. But so the interesting thing about this example is that they wanted to start renewable energy infrastructure projects in the emerging markets, in the developing world. And this is good to dwell on this a little bit because it's a very interesting point, because many people might say, it's like, oh, well, renewable infrastructure is like wind farms, solar panels, and that sort of thing. Oh, we're doing all of this, right? In Germany, in Denmark, and the Netherlands, and pension funds are lining up to invest in these things. But it's not as easy to do these things in emerging markets like sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia, et cetera. And so when it comes to those kinds of projects, when they go to pension funds, a pension fund will say, you want to do a wind farm in Mali? Well, we don't really know anything about Mali. We think there's political risk. We think there's currency risk. There's really sort of no legal structure there. What if anything goes wrong with this project? Like, do we go to the courts, or how does all of that work? And so typically when companies or individuals start these kind of projects and try to get funding from pension funds, they simply get a no. And so what was interesting about this project is that they set this up from the beginning using blended finance tools in a way that they could already demonstrate that they're meeting all of the requirements that pension funds typically have, or insurance companies, which was in my case for Aegon, who also ended up investing in this fund.
So did they? What did they offer a potential pension fund here? Did they somehow find a way to de-risk the project, or was there a counterparty they could rely on? How did they make it palatable to the pension fund?
Yeah, so they used a couple of tools. In our case, the most sort of specific example was they obtained a guarantee from a company called Atradius, which is the Dutch export credit agency. It's sort of like an insurance company that is sort of a quasi-governmental agency. And the interesting thing is that when you get this guarantee, that makes the project, in terms of risk, makes it equal to investing in a government-issued bond.
So very low risk, in fact.
The lowest risk. Dutch government bonds have a AAA rating, and if you have a project and you get a guarantee from Atradius, it also has a AAA rating. So basically, for a pension fund, everything else, and I'm simplifying a little bit here, obviously, but everything else, the fact that you're doing renewable energy, the fact that you're investing in a place like Mali, the fact that you're investing with people you've kind of never heard of. It's a company that is just starting out, has no track record, all becomes more or less irrelevant because the pension fund investment committee will simply say, we can allocate in sort of, AAA to AAA investments. This has a AAA rating. So that's kind of all we need to know. And obviously, again, simplifying, the process was a little bit longer than that, and more things come into play. But that is the key thing that at the end of the day, the pension fund will look at.
But in this case, anyways, the musicians started to play. And I don't know if you have followed the project. Was it in Mali indeed, the where infrastructure was built? So I'm just curious. So if I were to travel to Mali, would I see some windmills turning happily?
That's a good question. So Mali is just an example. It might very well be. Yes, they have done multiple projects, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Again, I don't know if Mali is amongst them. Might very well be, but in a case in countries like that, yes,
yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great example, and I specifically liked, as you pointed out, that there is a big difference between investing in German wind farms, where anyways also you have the German government, or you used to have at least as a counterparty through the feed-in tariff, versus one of the first wind parks in an African country, for example, for two reasons exactly. First of all is that there's just a lot less capital flowing to these countries for all the reasons that you stated. And second, that if we think about how the world's energy system, will transition to a low carbon energy system, it is extremely important that developing nations build up their energy system in a renewable way, rather than for the moment still rely on brown coal and so forth. So this is extremely important in terms of driving that change that you've been talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
One thing that I find curious about this, let's suppose infrastructure was built that otherwise wouldn't have been built for this blended finance project. So who had impact here? Is it the pension fund, given it's just basically a regular government bond that they're investing in, or is it the export credit agency? Is it the people in the ground in Mali? Who did it?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think it's everyone and no one, all at the same time. I think also, it kind of points to this question of intentionality and attributability. Can you attribute these kinds of impact to any particular person or investor? Yeah, these are interesting things to think about, mostly because for me, the question is, okay, if this works, how do we replicate it? And so how do we identify the parties that actually made this happen? And so I think there, to answer that question, it was really the people who set up climate fund managers. And I guess the origin of that was with FMO. But obviously they couldn't have done it if all of these other parties who were involved in this project didn't contribute in some way. But I think what you were also pointing to maybe is this question, which is often how sort of impact investment and ESG people approach the question is, who's responsible for this, in the sense like, who can score impact points with this? Yeah. And I think that's, while I kind of understand where it's coming from, I think it's a little bit unhelpful, because that really has to do more also with this intentionality question. I think in the world of impact investment, there's way too much emphasis on this aspect, and I think it has to do with sort of this sense of identity that people also derive from this. It's like, oh, hey, if I can score like 10 impact points out of this project, then that makes me like a more impactful, a better person than someone else who has no impact points, or maybe only 5 impact points. But at the end of the day, it's kind of this scoring mentality that, while I understand why sometimes that's simply how humans behave, it doesn't really help us direct more capital to where it's needed most. And also then the question really becomes not so much like, do we go to pension funds and bang them over the head and say you have to have intentionality, you have to care about impact, you have to score impact points. At the end of the day, most pension funds don't care as much about that. They simply care about making good investments. And so I think that's kind of what I think we should do, and also what we're now doing with this company that I started, Route 17. We basically want to go to pension funds and say, hey, here's a good investment.
Okay.
And then if they say, look, and we also like to score impact points, and say, okay, that's also fine. That's great. You can do that. This is kind of genuine impact. But the most important thing is that you put money in these things so that we can actually address these societal problems.
Yeah, it seems to me that that is the decisive point, right? That there actually has a problem been solved, and then it's secondary almost. How do you divvy that up? And it's probably often it's simply not possible to divvy it up, as you mentioned. It was everyone and no one, and you have many such situations where and I think that is the whole point of your analogy, that these players complement each other. I rarely hear somebody after a concert asking, so, what do you think? Who had the biggest impact on your enjoyment? Was it the violin or rather the horns?
Yeah.
No, I mean, obviously it's the point that they played together on time on the right notes and that they felt the music. And it's probably not that different in that case, right? The point is the outcome. I'd rather err on the side that everybody claims a little bit, as long as the fundamental something has happened is a given. That's also why I asked whether the windmills are actually turning. I think that is always an important question to ask in these contexts. Yeah,
absolutely agree. Yeah,
I mean, it seems to me that you might become, you have an ambition to take on this role to sort of get the band back together and find people to play. I like it. There are some, perhaps some critical voices also on blended finance, and It may not be easy sometimes. I remember vividly, we once hosted a party where exactly the point was to sort of, connect socially some potential philanthropic funders with people more from the development banking world. And it was vexing because the whole cocktail party was there for these people to mingle, but they somehow didn't. It was like oil and water. We had one group on the one side, the other group on the other side. They talked among themselves, but they didn't really mix. It was hard. Have you encountered that as well? Is there somehow, are these different worlds, or was it just an accident in our case?
No, unfortunately, I recognize this, and here also, I mean, the musical analogy also works because violinists are also very different from trumpet players, or a jazz musician is very different from a classical player, right? So from the outside, you might not think this, but often people speak a very different language, have very different interests, have different objectives or ambitions, and so forth. And so while on paper it might make sense, to bring them together, in practice this might actually be really difficult. And so this is exactly what's happening with blended finance. So I've worked a little bit in my career with all of these different actors. I've had exposure to development banks. I've worked with government representatives. I've worked with Wall Street types, with lawyers, with private equity, and so forth. And these are all different worlds, right? So this is also, I guess, something that's just typical for us humans. We're sort of tribal, right? So we identify with a certain group, and we kind of like being a private equity guy or girl and hanging out with other private equity people. But that means that we rarely, if ever, sort of hang out with people who are doing, like wind farms in Mali, for example. And so bringing those people together and then actually allowing them to work together is really difficult. And that's one of the things that I'd also like to contribute to. I do think it can be done if you create the right convening and collaboration platforms.
Yeah, so definitely a cultural element there. I think that is exactly what we saw as well. Although there are sometimes also fairly rational arguments, or at least sort of depending on the political economy in which people are moving. So, for instance, from people in the development banking world, I think they are very cautious to. I mean, this is super promising for them. They could leverage their balance sheet if they have, I don't know, 20 billion to spend in order to upgrade energy infrastructure.
Yeah.
if they would, just say, okay, we take the first loss, but 90% of the balance sheet of these projects could actually be filled up with money from pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, they would get a lot more infrastructure built. That's at least sort of in theory. But I think in practice, they're very cautious to appear in such a way that their taxpayer money ultimately, although it does what it's supposed to do, which is building infrastructure, also contributes to private profits of people who already own a lot of money. So I think that's a very sensitive issue for them. And that seems sometimes to be the reason why they shy away from these deals.
Absolutely. So that's an incredibly important point. Even though I can sympathize a little bit with that sort of point of view. I mean, you don't want to subsidize a bunch of fat cats, Wall Street's investors or bankers. At the same time, it's a little bit irrational, because really what you have to recognize is that there are different actors in society who have different sort of pots of money and who have different sort of incentives and criteria. And so what you're really doing with blended finance is just kind of making an optimal mix, playing to those specific criteria and incentives. And so I think the way that I would look at these things is like, yes, you may be sort of, subsidizing in sort of air quotation marks, Wall Street or a pension fund or a bank. But if that means that, instead of putting 10 million into a project, you can put 100 million into a project, that seems to me like a useful kind of leveraging of these kinds of actors. I think where we have to be very careful, and this is where critics do have a point, is that you have to design these tools in a way that they're kind of temporary. And, it can be temporary, like a year or 10 years or even 20 years. But we have to recognize that there is sort of this subsidizing going on, and that you should only do that, use subsidies or public money, as long as that's really needed. And I think if you look, for example, at renewable energy in Europe, this was heavily subsidized for many years. Just look at the German Energiewende, for example. But at some point, politicians need to come to this conclusion. It's like, okay, we did this for many years. It's worked. Look, we have wind farms everywhere. Pension funds are lining up to invest in these things. That probably means that we can now pull out the subsidies or kind of phase them out, and we can redirect this money and use it to subsidize other areas that now need this further development and encouragement. But that's a very tricky thing to do, because it's not like you have a piece of software that tells you exactly, is like, oh, it is now 31st of January, 2023. This means that, these markets or these technologies are now investable. You can pull out your money and then the clock starts ticking. It doesn't work like that. It's kind of, you have to look at all these different signals. You have to talk to all the actors in the market, and it's kind of a lot of judgment that comes into this. But it's a fair point, something you have to be aware of, but certainly not a reason not to do it.
Yeah, well, something that comes to mind is pension funds. In my experience, they very commonly have a policy of not being the first one to do anything. They always want that somebody has done it before them. Either they're invested in a fund, right? Every first time fundraising is a hard sell. So that's one indication, and certainly I think the first wind farm in Kenya is probably a hard sell to investors. The second one, probably a lot easier already. So it seems that this, the impact money should go towards pioneering projects, the first of its kind in terms of technology, country, and whatnot. Is that a common thing you observe or agree with?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, I mean, yes, there is a lot of bureaucracy in these organizations. And now I should also point out that the bureaucracy is often there for good reason, right? So pension funds or asset owners just generally often put in place all of these processes and rules and committees and, all the things that need to go into decision making to make sure that they allocate the money that is not theirs. It's like the pensioners' money. Make sure that they allocate this in a responsible way and can pay out pensions. So sometimes, yes, maybe these organizations go overboard a little bit, like any organization. But so again, I'm not sort of against bureaucracy in principle. It's just a question of navigating it. But so to your point, yes, I think often pension fund can make the biggest difference, or can have the largest impact, maybe not even by actually putting money into a project, but by giving access to some of the expertise or insights or just time. And this is something I've seen in practice, where if a project is looking for funding, if they can spend time with people who can explain how the pension fund allocates capital, like what is all the decision making, what is all the stuff you have to think about before approaching them, that can go a very long way for that project in terms of really understanding what they have to do to get access to that kind of money. And then especially if it's sort of like a first-time project or in frontier markets, then the demonstration effect of this can be very powerful, as you suggest.
Yes, exactly. The demonstration effect. I think that was what I was looking for in one word. Thank you, Harald. I think, unfortunately, we'll sort of have to wrap it up. But before we stop, or before we finish, I'd like to ask you, you're now deeply into this topic. What do you think is next in this world of blended finance, if we look ahead for 1 or 2 years? And what would you wish to happen, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a lot of different things are happening and need to happen. I think, you can sort of boil it down to the essence by saying that the conversation on sustainable finance is continuing, what we started out discussing. And increasingly, also the pension funds, insurance companies, so forth that I'm working with are also really coming to this view that, first of all, at the end of the day, of the three objectives, values alignment, financial, and impact is probably the most important one. That's kind of also what the man or the woman in the street thinks about when you say ESG or sustainable fund. Typically, people think like, oh, that's a fund. If I invest in this, then I help make the world a better place. And so I think people are starting to realize that, at the end of the day, if it's not about that, then what are we really doing? So that's one. And then two, obviously, as we discussed, realizing that a lot of these sustainable finance tools aren't really working as well as we hoped. And so that's one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening then is that increasingly institutional investors, like the pension funds, then are starting to say, okay, well, if the point is to have impact, and if all this ESG stuff isn't really doing that, we need to think about not sustainable finance, but financing sustainability. And then very quickly you realize that all of those projects, all of those solutions you want to put in place are not investable yet, as they are today. So they're starting to come to the conclusion, or they need to come to the conclusion, that blended finance is then your friend, or it's kind of the tool you need to use if you still want to make those commitments, have impact, and actually put the money into impact. Then that's inevitably where you end up. So that's what needs to happen, those two things. But I think it's already happening. So I'm actually very sort of encouraged and optimistic about the future of sustainable finance.
Very well. Thank you so much, Harald. I'm also very optimistic about what you're going to achieve and do in this space, and wish you all the best in your musical, professional, and other endeavors. Thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Great conversation, and thanks so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
All
Thank
right.
you. We have a small bonus for today's episode. As you have heard, Harald is also a musician, a jazz pianist, and I've asked him if we could play some of his music on the show, and he generously agreed. So if you just stay in and listen, you will hear a piece from his album Music at Night by the band called The New York Second, and the track is called Him, a Bull, Ha, a Bird. I wish you lots of fun with it.